Hello, beautiful listener. Today I have 8 magical tales full of true love, princesses and fabulous hair. So sit back, relax, and don't forget to like, subscribe and share. I hope you enjoy them. Cinderella by the Brothers Grimm. There was once a rich man whose wife lay sick, and when she felt her end drawing near, she called to her only daughter to come near her bed and said, "Dear child, be pious and good, and God will always take care of you, and I will look down upon you from heaven and will be with you." And then she closed her eyes and expired. The maiden went every day to her mother's grave and wept, and was always pious and good. When the winter came, the snow covered the grave with a white covering, and when the sun came in the early spring and melted it away, the man took to himself another wife. The new wife brought 2 daughters home with her, and they were beautiful and fair in appearance, but at heart were black and ugly. And then began very evil times for the poor stepdaughter. "Is the stupid creature to sit in the same room with us?" said they. "Those who eat food must earn it." They took away her pretty dresses and put on her an old grey kirtle and gave her wooden shoes to wear. "Just look now at the proud princess, how she's decked out," cried they, laughing, and then they sent her into the kitchen. There she was obliged to do heavy work from morning to night, get up early in the morning, draw water, make the fires, cook and wash. Besides that, the sisters did their utmost to torment her, mocking her and strewing peas and lentils among the ashes and setting her to pick them up. In the evenings, when she was quite tired out with her hard day's work, she had no bed to lie on but was obliged to rest on the hearth among the cinders. And as she always looked dusty and dirty, they named her Cinderella. It happened one day that the father went to the fair, and he asked his 2 stepdaughters what he should bring back for them. "Fine clothes," said one. "Pearls and jewels," said the other. "But what will you have, Cinderella?" said he. "The first twig, father, that strikes against your hat on the way home, that is what I should like you to bring me." So he bought for the 2 stepdaughters fine clothes, pearls and jewels, and on his way back, as he rode through a green lane, a hazel twig struck against his hat, and he broke it off and carried it home with him. And when he reached home, he gave to the stepdaughters what they had wished for, and to Cinderella he gave the hazel twig. She thanked him and went to her mother's grave, and planted this twig there, weeping so bitterly that the tears fell upon it and watered it, and it flourished and became a fine tree. Cinderella went to see it 3 times a day, and wept and prayed, and each time a white bird rose up from the tree, and if she uttered any wish, the bird brought her whatever she had wished for. Now it came to pass that the king ordained a festival that should last for 3 days, and to which all the beautiful young women of that country were bidden, so that the king's son might choose a bride from among them. When the 2 stepdaughters heard that they too were bidden to appear, they felt very pleased, and they called Cinderella and said, "Comb our hair, brush our shoes, and make our buckles fast. We are going to the wedding feast at the king's castle." Cinderella, when she heard this, could not help crying, for she too would have liked to go to the dance, and she begged her stepmother to allow her. "What, you Cinderella?" said she. "In all your dust and dirt, you want to go to the festival? You that have no dress and no shoes, you want to dance?" But as she persisted in asking, at last the stepmother said, "I have strewed a dish full of lentils in the ashes, and if you can pick them all up again in 2 hours, you may go with use." Then the maiden went to the back door that led into the garden and called out, "O gentle doves, O turtle doves, and all the birds that be, the lentils that in ashes lie, come and pick up for me. The good must be put in the dish, the bad you may eat if you wish." Then there came to the kitchen window 2 white doves, and after them some turtle doves, and at last a crowd of all the birds under heaven, chirping and fluttering, and they alighted among the ashes. And the doves nodded with their heads and began to pick, peck, pick, peck, and then all the others began to pick, peck, pick, peck, and put all the good grains into the dish. Before an hour was over, all was done, and they flew away. Then the maiden brought the dish to her stepmother, feeling joyful, and thinking that now she should go to the feast. But the stepmother said, "No, Cinderella, you have no proper clothes, and you do not know how to dance, and you would be laughed at." And when Cinderella cried for disappointment, she added, "If you can pick 2 dishes full of lentils out of the ashes, nice and clean, you shall go with us," thinking to herself, "For that is not possible." When she had strewed 2 dishes full of lentils among the ashes, the maiden went through the back door into the garden and cried, "O gentle doves, O turtle doves, and all the birds that be, the lentils that in ashes lie, come and pick up for me. The good must be put in the dish, the bad you may eat if you wish." So there came to the kitchen window 2 white doves, and then some turtle doves, and at last a crowd of all the other birds under heaven, chirping and fluttering, and they alighted among the ashes, and the doves nodded with their heads and began to pick, and then all the others began to pick, and put all the good grains into the dish. And before half an hour was over, it was all done, and they flew away. Then the maiden took the dishes to the stepmother, feeling joyful and thinking that now she should go with them to the feast. But she said, "All this is of no good to you. You cannot come with us, for you have no proper clothes and cannot dance. You would put us to shame." Then she turned her back on poor Cinderella and made haste to set out with her 2 proud daughters. And as there was no one left in the house, Cinderella went to her mother's grave under the hazel bush and cried, little tree, shake over me, that silver and gold may come down and cover me." Then the bird threw down a dress of gold and silver, and a pair of slippers embroidered with silk and silver. And in all haste she put on the dress and went to the festival. But her stepmother and sisters did not know her, and thought she must be a foreign princess, she looked so beautiful in her golden dress. Of Cinderella they never thought at all, and supposed that she was sitting at home, arid, picking the lentils out of the ashes. The king's son came to meet her and took her by the hand and danced with her, and he refused to stand up with anyone else, so that he might not be obliged to let go her hand. And when anyone came to claim it, he answered, "She is my partner." And when the evening came, she wanted to go home, but the prince said he would go with her to take care of her, for he wanted to see where the beautiful maiden lived, but she escaped him and jumped up into the pigeon house. Then the prince waited until the father came and told him the strange maiden had jumped into the pigeon house. The father thought to himself, "It cannot surely be Cinderella," and called for axes and hatchets, and had the pigeon house cut down, but there was no one in it. And when they entered the house, there sat Cinderella in her dirty clothes among the cinders, and a little oil lamp burnt dimly in the chimney. For Cinderella had been very quick, and had jumped out of the pigeon house again, and had run to the hazel bush. And there she had taken off her beautiful dress and had laid it on the grave, and the bird had carried it away again. And then she had put on her little grey kirtle again and had sat down in the kitchen among the cinders. The next day, when the festival began anew and the parents and stepsisters had gone to it, Cinderella went to the hazel bush and cried, little tree, shake over me, so that silver and gold may come down and cover me." Then the bird cast down a still more splendid dress than on the day before. And when she appeared in it among the guests, everyone was astonished at her beauty. The prince had been waiting until she came, and he took her hand and danced with her alone. And when anyone else came to invite her, he said, "She is my partner." And when the evening came, she wanted to go home, and the prince followed her, for he wanted to see to what house she belonged. But she broke away from him and ran into the garden at the back of the house. There stood a fine large tree, bearing splendid pears. She leapt as lightly as a squirrel among the branches, and the prince did not know what had become of her. So he waited until the father came, and then he told him that the strange maiden had rushed from him, and that he thought she had gone up into the pear tree. The father thought to himself, "It cannot surely be Cinderella," and called for an axe and felled the tree, but there was no one in it. And when they went into the kitchen, there sat Cinderella among the cinders as usual, for she had got down the other side of the tree, and had taken back her beautiful clothes to the bird on the hazel bush, and had put on her old grey kirtle again. On the 3rd day, when the parents and the stepchildren had set off, Cinderella went again to her mother's grave, and said to the tree, little tree, shake over me, that silver and gold may come down and cover me." Then the bird cast down a dress, the like of which had never been seen for splendour and brilliancy, and slippers that were of gold. And when she appeared in this dress at the feast, nobody knew what to say for wonderment. The prince danced with her alone, and if anyone else asked her, he answered, "She is my partner." And when it was evening, Cinderella wanted to go home, and the prince was about to go with her, when she ran past him so quickly that he could not follow her. But he had laid a plan and had caused all the steps to be spread with pitch, so that as she rushed down them the left shoe of the maiden remained sticking in it. The prince picked it up and saw that it was of gold and very small and slender. The next morning he went to the father and told him that none should be his bride, save the one whose foot the golden shoe should fit. Then the two sisters were very glad, because they had pretty feet. The eldest went to her room to try on the shoe, and her mother stood by. But she could not get her great toe into it, for the shoe was too small. Then her mother handed her a knife and said, "Cut the toe off, for when you are queen, you will never have to go on foot." So the girl cut her toe off, squeezed her foot into the shoe, concealed the pain, and went down to the prince. Then he took her with him on his horse as his bride and rode off. They had to pass by the grave, and there sat the two pigeons on the hazel bush and cried, "There they go, there they go. There is blood on her shoe. The shoe is too small and not the right bride at all." Then the prince looked at her shoe and saw the blood flowing, and he turned his horse round and took the false bride home again, saying she was not the right one, and that the other sister must try on the shoe. So she went into her room to do so, and got her toes comfortably in, but her heel was too large. Then her mother handed her the knife, saying, "Cut a piece off your heel. When you are queen, you will never have to go on foot." So the girl cut a piece off her heel, and thrust her foot into the shoe, concealed the pain, and went down to the prince, who took his bride before him on his horse and rode off. When they passed by the hazel bush, the two pigeons sat there and cried, "There they go, there they go. There is blood on her shoe. The shoe is too small, not the right bride at all." Then the prince looked at her foot and saw how the blood was flowing from the shoe and staining the white stocking. And he turned his horse round and brought the false bride home again. "This is not the right one," said he. "Have you no other daughter?" "No," said the man. "Only my dead wife left behind her, a little stunted Cinderella. It is impossible that she can be the bride." But the king's son ordered her to be sent for. But the mother said, "Oh no, she's much too dirty. I could not let her be seen." But he would have her fetched, and so Cinderella had to appear. First she washed her face and hands quite clean, and went in and curtsied to the prince, who held out to her the golden shoe. Then she sat down on a stool, drew her foot out of the heavy wooden shoe, and slipped it into the golden one, which fitted it perfectly. And when she stood up and the prince looked in her face, he knew again the beautiful maiden that had danced with him, and he cried, "This is the right bride." The stepmother and the two sisters were thunderstruck and grew pale with anger, but he put Cinderella before him on his horse and rode off. And as they passed the hazel bush, the two white pigeons cried, "There they go, there they go. There's no blood on her shoe. The shoe's not too small. The right bride is she after all." And when they had thus cried, they came flying after and perched on Cinderella's shoulders, one on the right, the other on the left, and so remained. And when her wedding with the prince was appointed to be held, the false sisters came, hoping to curry favour and to take part in the festivities. So as the bridal procession went to the church, the eldest walked on the right side and the younger on the left, and the pigeons picked out an eye of each of them. And as they returned, the elder was on the left side and the younger on the right, and the pigeons picked out the other eye of each of them. And so they were condemned to go blind for the rest of their days, because of their wickedness and falsehood. Rapunzel, by the Brothers Grimm. There once lived a man and his wife who had long wished for a child, but in vain. Now there was at the back of their house a little window which overlooked a beautiful garden full of the finest vegetables and flowers. But there was a high wall all round it, and no one ventured into it, for it belonged to a witch of great might, and of whom all the world was afraid. One day that the wife was standing at the window and looking into the garden, she saw a bed filled with the finest rampion, and it looked so fresh and green that she began to wish for some, and at length she longed for it greatly. This went on for days, and as she knew she could not get the rampion, she pined away and grew pale and miserable. Then the man was uneasy and asked, "What is the matter, dear wife?" "Oh," answered she, "I shall die unless I can have some of that rampion to eat that grows in the garden at the back of our house." The man, who loved her very much, thought to himself, "Rather than lose my wife, I will get some rampion, cost what it will." So in the twilight he climbed over the wall into the witch's garden, plucked hastily a handful of rampion and brought it to his wife. She made a salad of it at once, and ate of it to her heart's content, but she liked it so much and it tasted so good that the next day she longed for it thrice as much as she had done before. If she was to have any rest, the man must climb over the wall once more. So he went in the twilight again, and as he was climbing back he saw all at once the witch standing before him, and was terribly frightened as she cried with angry eyes, "How dare you climb over into my garden like a thief and steal my rampion? It shall be the worse for you." "Oh," answered he, "be merciful rather than just. I have only done it through necessity. For my wife saw your rampion out of the window, and became possessed with so great a longing that she would have died if she could not have had some to eat." Then the witch said, "If it is all as you say, you may have as much rampion as you like, on one condition: the child that will come into the world must be given to me. It shall go well with the child, and I will care for it like a mother." In his distress of mind the man promised everything, and when the time came when the child was born, the witch appeared, and giving the child the name of Rapunzel, which is the same as rampion, she took it away with her. Rapunzel was the most beautiful child in the world. When she was 12 years old, the witch shut her up in a tower in the midst of a wood, and it had neither steps nor door, only a small window above. When the witch wished to be let in, she would stand below and would cry, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Rapunzel had beautiful long hair that shone like gold. When she heard the voice of the witch, she would undo the fastening of the upper window, unbind the plaits of her hair, and let it down 20 ells below, and the witch would climb up by it. After they had lived thus a few years, it happened that as the king's son was riding through the wood, he came to the tower, and as he drew near, he heard a voice singing so sweetly that he stood still and listened. It was Rapunzel in her loneliness trying to pass away the time with sweet songs. The king's son wished to go into her, and sought to find a door in the tower, but there was none. So he rode home, but the song had entered into his heart, and every day he went into the wood and listened to it. Once, as he was standing there under a tree, he saw the witch come up, and listened while she called out, "Oh, Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Then he saw how Rapunzel let down her long tresses, and how the witch climbed up by it and went into her, and he said to himself, "Since that is the ladder, I will climb it and seek my fortune." And the next day, as soon as it began to grow dusk, he went to the tower and cried, "Oh, Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." And she let down her hair, and the king's son climbed up by it. Rapunzel was greatly terrified when she saw that a man had come into her, for she had never seen one before. But the king's son began speaking so kindly to her, and told how her singing had entered into his heart, so that he could have no peace until he had seen her herself. Then Rapunzel forgot her terror, and when he asked her to take him for her husband, and she saw that he was young and beautiful, she thought to herself, "I certainly like him much better than old Mother Gothel." And she put her hand into his hand. She said, "I would willingly go with thee, but I do not know how I shall get out. When thou comest, bring each time a silken rope, and I will make a ladder, and when it is quite ready, I will get down by it out of the tower, and thou shalt take me away on thy horse." They agreed that he should come to her every evening, as the old woman came in the daytime. So the witch knew nothing of all this, until once Rapunzel said to her unwittingly, "Mother Gothel, how is it that you climb up here so slowly, and the king's son is with me in a moment?" "Oh, wicked child," cried the witch, "what is this I hear? I thought I had hidden thee from all the world, and thou hast betrayed me." In her anger, she seized Rapunzel by her beautiful hair, struck her several times with her left hand, and then grasping a pair of shears in her right, snip, snap, the beautiful locks lay on the ground. And she was so hard-hearted that she took Rapunzel and put her in a waste and desert place where she lived in great woe and misery. The same day on which she took Rapunzel away, she went back to the tower in the evening and made fast the severed locks of hair to the window hasp. And the king's son came and cried, "Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair." Then she let the hair down, and the king's son climbed up, but instead of his dearest Rapunzel, he found the witch looking at him with wicked, glittering eyes. "Aha!" cried she, mocking him. "You came for your darling, but the sweet bird sits no longer in the nest and sings no more. The cat has got her, and will scratch out your eyes as well. Rapunzel is lost to you, you will see her no more." The king's son was beside himself with grief, and in his agony he sprang from the tower. He escaped with life, but the thorns on which he fell put out his eyes. Then he wandered blind through the wood, eating nothing but roots and berries, and doing nothing but lament and weep for the loss of his dearest wife. So he wandered several years in misery, until at last he came to the desert place where Rapunzel lived with her twin children that she had borne, a boy and a girl. At first, he heard a voice that he thought he knew, and when he reached the place from which it seemed to come, Rapunzel knew him and fell on his neck and wept. And when her tears touched his eyes, they became clear again, and he could see with them as well as ever. Then he took her to his kingdom, where he was received with great joy, and there they lived long and happily. The Little Mermaid, by Hans Christian Andersen. Far out in the ocean the water is as blue as the petals of the loveliest cornflower, and as clear as the purest glass. But it is very deep too. It goes down deeper than any anchor rope will go, and many, many steeples would have to be stacked one on top of another to reach from the bottom to the surface of the sea. It is down there that the sea folk live. Now don't suppose that there are only bare white sands at the bottom of the sea. No, indeed. The most marvellous trees and flowers grow down there, with such pliant stalks and leaves that the least stir in the water makes them move about as though they were alive. All sorts of fish, large and small, dart among the branches, just as birds flit through the trees up here. From the deepest spot in the ocean rises the palace of the Sea King. Its walls are made of coral and its high-pointed windows of the clearest amber, but the roof is made of mussel shells that open and shut with the tide. This is a wonderful sight to see, for every shell holds glistening pearls, any one of which would be the pride of a queen's crown. The Sea King down there had been a widower for years, and his old mother kept house for him. She was a clever woman, but very proud of her noble birth. Therefore she flaunted 12 oysters on her tail, while the other ladies of the court were only allowed to wear 6. Except for this, she was an altogether praiseworthy person, particularly so because she was extremely fond of her granddaughters, the little sea princesses. They were 6 lovely girls, but the youngest was the most beautiful of them all. Her skin was as soft and tender as a rose petal, and her eyes were as blue as the deep sea, but like all the others she had no feet. Her body ended in a fishtail. The whole day long they used to play in the palace, down in the great halls where live flowers grew on the walls. Whenever the high amber windows were thrown open, the fish would swim in, just as swallows dart into our rooms when we open the windows. But these fish now would swim right up to the little princesses to eat out of their hands and let themselves be petted. Outside the palace was a big garden, with flaming red and deep blue trees. Their fruit glittered like gold, and their blossoms flamed like fire on their constantly waving stalks. The soil was very fine sand indeed, but as blue as burning brimstone. A strange blue veil lay over everything down there. You would have thought yourself aloft in the air, with only the blue sky above and beneath you, rather than down at the bottom of the sea. When there was a dead calm, you could just see the sun, like a scarlet flower with light streaming from its calyx. Each little princess had her own small garden plot, where she could dig and plant whatever she liked. One of them made her little flower bed in the shape of a whale. Another thought it neater to shape hers like a little mermaid, but the youngest of them made hers as round as the sun, and there she grew only flowers which were as red as the sun itself. She was an unusual child, quiet and wistful, and when her sisters decorated their gardens with all kinds of odd things they had found in sunken ships, she would allow nothing in hers except flowers as red as the sun and a pretty marble statue. This figure of a handsome boy, carved in pure white marble, had sunk down to the bottom of the sea from some ship that was wrecked. Beside the statue, she planted a rose-coloured weeping willow tree, which thrived so well that its graceful branches shaded the statue and hung down to the blue sand, where their shadows took on a violet tint and swayed as the branches swayed. It looked as if the roots and the tips of the branches were kissing each other in play. Nothing gave the youngest princess such pleasure as to hear about the world of human beings up above them. Her old grandmother had to tell her all she knew about ships and cities and of people and animals. What seemed nicest of all to her was that up on land the flowers were fragrant, for those at the bottom of the sea had no scent. And she thought it was nice that the woods were green, and that the fish you saw among their branches could sing so loud and sweet that it was delightful to hear them. Her grandmother had to call the little birds fish, or the princess would not have known what she was talking about, for she had never seen a bird. "When you get to be 15, her grandmother said, "you will be allowed to rise up out of the ocean and sit on the rocks in the moonlight, to watch the great ships sailing by. You will see woods and towns too." Next year one of her sisters would be 15, but the others, well, since each was a whole year older than the next, the youngest still had 5 long years to wait until she could rise up from the water and see what our world was like. But each sister promised to tell the others about all that she saw, and what she found most marvellous on her first day. Their grandmother had not told them half enough, and there were so many things that they longed to know about. The most eager of them all was the youngest, the very one who was so quiet and wistful. Many a night she stood by her open window and looked up through the dark blue water where the fish waved their fins and tails. She could just see the moon and stars. To be sure, their light was quite dim, but looked at through the water they seemed much bigger than they appear to us. Whenever a cloud-like shadow swept across them, she knew that it was either a whale swimming overhead or a ship with many human beings aboard it. Little did they dream that a pretty young mermaid was down below, stretching her white arms up toward the keel of their ship. The eldest princess had her 15th birthday, so now she received permission to rise up out of the water. When she got back, she had 100 things to tell her sisters about, but the most marvellous thing of all, she said, was to lie on a sandbar in the moonlight when the sea was calm and to gaze at the large city on the shore where the lights twinkled like hundreds of stars, to listen to music, to hear the chatter and clamour of carriages and people, to see so many church towers and spires, and to hear the ringing bells. Because she could not enter the city, that was just what she most dearly longed to do. Oh, how intently the youngest sister listened. After this, whenever she stood at her open window at night and looked up through the dark blue waters, she thought of that great city with all of its clatter and clamour, and even fancied that in these depths she could hear the church bells ring. The next year, her second sister had permission to rise up to the surface and swim wherever she pleased. She came up just at sunset, and she said that this spectacle was the most marvellous sight she had ever seen. The heavens had a golden glow, and as for the clouds, she could not find words to describe their beauty. Splashed with red and tinted with violet, they sailed over her head. But much faster than the sailing clouds were wild swans in a flock. Like a long white veil trailing above the sea, they flew toward the setting sun. She too swam toward it, but down it went, and all the rose-coloured glow faded from the sea and sky. The following year, her third sister ascended, and as she was the boldest of them all, she swam up a broad river that flowed into the ocean. She saw gloriously green, vine-coloured hills. Palaces and manor houses could be glimpsed through the splendid woods. She heard all the birds sing, and the sun shone so brightly that often she had to dive under the water to cool her burning face. In a small cove, she found a whole school of mortal children, paddling about in the water quite naked. She wanted to play with them, but they took fright and ran away. Then along came a little black animal. It was a dog, but she had never seen a dog before. It barked at her so ferociously that she took fright herself and fled to the open sea. But never could she forget the splendid woods, the green hills, and the nice children who could swim in the water, although they didn't wear fishtails. The fourth sister was not so venturesome. She stayed far out among the rough waves, which she said was a marvellous place. You could see all around you for miles and miles, and the heavens up above you were like a vast dome of glass. She had seen ships, but they were so far away that they looked like seagulls. Playful dolphins had turned somersaults, and monstrous whales had spouted water through their nostrils, so that it looked as if hundreds of fountains were playing all around them. Now the fifth sister had her turn. Her birthday came in the winter-time, so she saw things that none of the others had seen. The sea was a deep green colour, and enormous icebergs drifted about. Each one glistened like a pearl, she said, but they were more lofty than any church steeple built by man. They assumed the most fantastic shapes and sparkled like diamonds. She had seated herself on the largest one, and all the ships that came sailing by sped away as soon as the frightened sailors saw her there, with her long hair blowing in the wind. In the late evening, clouds filled the sky. Thunder cracked and lightning darted across the heavens. Black waves lifted those great bergs of ice on high, where they flashed when the lightning struck. On all the ships the sails were reefed, and there was fear and trembling. But quietly she sat there upon her drifting iceberg and watched the blue forked lightning strike the sea. Each of the sisters took delight in the lovely new sights when she first rose up to the surface of the sea. But when they became grown-up girls who were allowed to go wherever they liked, they became indifferent to it. They would become homesick, and in a month they said that there was no place like the bottom of the sea where they felt so completely at home. On many an evening the older sisters would rise to the surface, arm in arm, all 5 in a row. They had beautiful voices, more charming than those of any mortal beings. When a storm was brewing and they anticipated a shipwreck, they would swim before the ship and sing most seductively of how beautiful it was at the bottom of the ocean, trying to overcome the prejudice that the sailors had against coming down to them. But people could not understand their song, and mistook it for the voice of the storm, nor was it for them to see the glories of the deep. When their ship went down, they were drowned, and it was as dead men that they reached the sea king's palace. On the evenings when the mermaids rose through the water like this, arm in arm, their youngest sister stayed behind all alone, looking after them and wanting to weep. But a mermaid has no tears, and therefore she suffers so much more. "Oh, how I do wish I were 15, she said. "I know I shall love that world up there and all the people who live in it." And at last she too came to be 15. "Now I'll have you off my hands," said her grandmother, the old Queen Dowager. "Come, let me adorn you like your sisters." In the little maid's hair she put a wreath of white lilies, each petal of which was formed from half of a pearl, and the old queen let 8 big oysters fasten themselves to the princess's tail as a sign of her high rank. "But that hurts," said the little mermaid. "You must put up with a good deal to keep up appearances," her grandmother told her. Oh, how gladly she would have shaken off all these decorations and laid aside the cumbersome wreath. The red flowers in her garden were much more becoming to her, but she didn't dare to make any changes. "Goodbye," she said, and up she went through the water, as light and as sparkling as a bubble. The sun had just gone down when her head rose above the surface, but the clouds still shone like gold and roses, and in the delicately tinted sky sparkled the clear gleam of the evening star. The air was mild and fresh and the sea unruffled. A great 3-master lay in view with only one of all its sails set, for there was not even the whisper of a breeze, and the sailors idled about in the rigging and on the yards. There was music and singing on the ship, and as night came on, they lighted hundreds of such brightly coloured lanterns that one might have thought the flags of all nations were swinging in the air. The little mermaid swam right up to the window of the main cabin, and each time she rose with the swell, she could peep in through the clear glass panes at the crowd of brilliantly dressed people within. The handsomest of them all was a young prince with big dark eyes. He could not be more than 16 years old. It was his birthday, and that was the reason for all the celebration. Up on deck the sailors were dancing, and when the prince appeared among them, 100 or more rockets flew through the air, making it as bright as day. These startled the little mermaid so badly that she ducked under the water. But she soon peeped up again, and then it seemed as if all the stars in the sky were falling around her. Never had she seen such fireworks. Great suns spun around, splendid firefish floated through the blue air, and all these things were mirrored in the crystal clear sea. It was so brilliantly bright that you could see every little rope of the ship, and the people could be seen distinctly. Oh, how handsome the young prince was! He laughed, and he smiled and shook people by the hand, while the music rang out in the perfect evening. It got very late, but the little mermaid could not take her eyes off the ship and the handsome prince. The brightly coloured lanterns were put out, no more rockets flew through the air, and no more cannon boomed, but there was a mutter and rumble deep down in the sea, and the swell kept bouncing her up so high that she could look into the cabin. Now the ship began to sail. Canvas after canvas was spread in the wind, the waves rose high, great clouds gathered, and lightning flashed in the distance. Ah, they were in for a terrible storm, and the mariners made haste to reef the sails. The tall ship pitched and rolled as it sped through the angry sea. The waves rose up like towering black mountains, as if they would break over the masthead, but the swan-like ship plunged into the valleys between such waves, and emerged to ride their lofty heights. To the little mermaid this seemed good sport, but to the sailors it was nothing of the sort. The ship creaked and laboured. Thick timbers gave way under the heavy blows. Waves broke over the ship. The mainmast snapped in two like a reed. The ship listed over on its side and water burst into the hold. Now the little mermaid saw that people were in peril and that she herself must take care to avoid the beams and wreckage tossed about by the sea. One moment it would be black as pitch and she couldn't see a thing. Next moment the lightning would flash so brightly that she could distinguish every soul on board. Everyone was looking out for himself as best he could. She watched closely for the young prince, and when the ship split in two, she saw him sink down in the sea. At first she was overjoyed that he would be with her, but then she recalled that human people could not live under the water, and he could only visit her father's palace as a dead man. No, he should not die. So she swam in among all the floating planks and beams, completely forgetting that they might crush her. She dived through the waves and rode their crests, until at length she reached the young prince, who was no longer able to swim in that raging sea. His arms and legs were exhausted, his beautiful eyes were closing, and he would have died if the little mermaid had not come to help him. She held his head above water and let the waves take them wherever the waves went. At daybreak, when the storm was over, not a trace of the ship was in view. The sun rose out of the waters, red and bright, and its beams seemed to bring the glow of life back to the cheeks of the prince, but his eyes remained closed. The mermaid kissed his high and shapely forehead. As she stroked his wet hair in place, it seemed to her that he looked like that marble statue in her little garden. She kissed him again, and hoped that he would live. She saw dry land rise before her in high blue mountains, topped with snow as glistening white as if a flock of swans were resting there. Down by the shore were splendid green woods, and in the foreground stood a church or perhaps a convent. She didn't know which, but anyway, it was a building. Orange and lemon trees grew in its garden, and tall palm trees grew beside the gateway. Here the sea formed a little harbour, quite calm and very deep. Fine white sand had been washed up below the cliffs. She swam there with the handsome prince and stretched him out on the sand, taking special care to pillow his head up high in the warm sunlight. The bells began to ring in the great white building, and a number of young girls came out into the garden. The little mermaid swam away behind some tall rocks that stuck out of the water. She covered her hair and her shoulders with foam so that no one could see her tiny face, and then she watched to see who would find the poor prince. In a little while one of the young girls came upon him. She seemed frightened, but only for a minute. Then she called more people. The mermaid watched the prince regain consciousness and smile at everyone around him. But he did not smile at her, for he did not even know that she had saved him. She felt very unhappy, and when they led him away to the big building, she dived sadly down into the water and returned to her father's palace. She had always been quiet and wistful, and now she became much more so. Her sisters asked her what she had seen on her first visit up to the surface, but she would not tell them a thing. Many evenings and many mornings she revisited the spot where she had left the prince. She saw the fruit in the garden ripened and harvested, and she saw the snow on the high mountain melted away. But she did not see the prince, so each time she came home sadder than she had left. It was her one consolation to sit in her little garden and throw her arms about the beautiful marble statue that looked so much like the prince. But she took no care of her flowers now. They overgrew the paths until the place was a wilderness, and their long stalks and leaves became so entangled in the branches of the tree that it cast a gloomy shade. Finally, she couldn't bear it any longer. She told her secret to one of her sisters. Immediately, all the other sisters heard about it. No one else knew except a few more mermaids who told no one, except their most intimate friends. One of these friends knew who the prince was. She too had seen the birthday celebration on the ship. She knew where he came from and where his kingdom was. "Come, little sister," said the other princesses. Arm in arm they rose from the water in a long row, right in front of where they knew the prince's palace stood. It was built of pale, glistening golden stone with great marble staircases, one of which led down to the sea. Magnificent gilt domes rose above the roof, and between the pillars all around the building were marble statues that looked most lifelike. Through the clear glass of the lofty windows, one could see into the splendid halls, with their costly silk hangings and tapestries, and walls covered with paintings that were delightful to behold. In the centre of the main hall, a large fountain played its columns of spray up to the glass-domed roof, through which the sun shone down on the water and upon the lovely plants that grew in the big basin. Now that she knew where he lived, many an evening and many a night she spent there in the sea. She swam much closer to shore than any of her sisters would dare venture, and she even went far up a narrow stream, under the splendid marble balcony that cast its long shadow in the water. Here she used to sit and watch the young prince when he thought himself quite alone in the bright moonlight. On many evenings she saw him sail out in his fine boat, with music playing and flags aflutter. She would peep out through the green rushes, and if the wind blew her long silver veil, anyone who saw it mistook it for a swan spreading its wings. On many nights she saw the fishermen come out to sea with their torches, and heard them tell about how kind the young prince was. This made her proud to think that it was she who had saved his life when he was buffeted about, half dead among the waves, and she thought of how softly his head had rested on her breast, and how tenderly she had kissed him, though he knew nothing of all this, nor could he even dream of it. Increasingly, she grew to like human beings, and more she longed to live among them. Their world seemed so much wider than her own, for they could skim over the sea in ships, and mount up into the lofty peaks high over the clouds, and their land stretched out in woods and fields farther than the eye could see. There was so much she wanted to know. Her sisters could not answer all her questions, so she asked her old grandmother, who knew about the upper world, which was what she said was the right name for the countries above the sea. "If men aren't drowned," the little mermaid asked, "do they live on forever? Don't they die as we do down here in the sea?" "Yes," the old lady said, "they too must die, and their lifetimes are even shorter than ours. We can live to be 300 years old, but when we perish we turn into mere foam on the sea, and haven't even a grave down here among our dear ones. We have no immortal soul, no life hereafter. We are like the green seaweed. Once cut down, it never grows again. Human beings, on the contrary, have a soul which lives forever, long after their bodies have turned to clay. It rises through thin air up to the shining stars. Just as we rise through the water to see the lands on earth, so men rise up to beautiful places unknown, which we shall never see." "Why weren't we given an immortal soul?" the little mermaid sadly asked. "I would gladly give up my 300 years if I could be a human being only for a day, and later share in that heavenly realm." "You must not think about that," said the old lady. "We fare much more happily and are much better off than the folk up there." "Then I must also die and float as foam upon the sea, not hearing the music of the waves, and seeing neither the beautiful flowers nor the red sun. Can't I do anything at all to win an immortal soul?" "No," her grandmother answered, "not unless a human being loved you so much that you meant more to him than his father and mother. If his every thought and his whole heart cleaved to you so that he would let a priest join his right hand to yours, and would promise to be faithful here and throughout all eternity, then his soul would dwell in your body, and you would share in the happiness of mankind. He would give you a soul, and yet keep his own. But that can never come to pass. The very thing that is your greatest beauty here in the sea, your fishtail, would be considered ugly on land. They have such poor taste that to be thought beautiful there, you have to have 2 awkward props which they call legs." The little mermaid sighed and looked unhappily at her fishtail. "Come, let us be gay," the old lady said. "Let us leap and bound throughout the 300 years that we have to live. Surely that is time and to spare, and afterwards we shall be glad enough to rest in our graves. We are holding a court ball this evening." This was a much more glorious affair than is ever to be seen on earth. The walls and the ceiling of the great ballroom were made of massive but transparent glass. Many hundreds of huge rose-red and grass-green shells stood on each side in rows, with the blue flames that burned in each shell illuminating the whole room and shining through the walls so clearly that it was quite bright in the sea outside. You could see the countless fish, great and small, swimming toward the glass walls. On some of them the scales gleamed purplish-red, while others were silver and gold. Across the floor of the hall ran a wide stream of water, and upon this the mermaids and mermen danced to their own entrancing songs. Such beautiful voices are not to be heard among the people who live on land. The little mermaid sang more sweetly than anyone else, and everyone applauded her. For a moment her heart was happy, because she knew she had the loveliest voice of all, in the sea or on the land. But her thoughts soon strayed to the world up above. She could not forget the charming prince, nor her sorrow that she did not have an immortal soul like his. Therefore she stole out of her father's palace, and while everything there was song and gladness, she sat sadly in her own little garden. Then she heard a bugle call through the water, and she thought, "That must mean he is sailing up there. He whom I love more than my father or mother, he of whom I am always thinking, and in whose hands I would so willingly trust my lifelong happiness. I dare do anything to win him and to gain an immortal soul. While my sisters are dancing here in my father's palace, I shall visit the sea witch of whom I have always been so afraid. Perhaps she will be able to advise me and help me." The little mermaid set out from her garden toward the whirlpools that raged in front of the witch's dwelling. She had never gone that way before. No flowers grew there, nor any seaweed. Bare and grey, the sands extended to the whirlpools, where like roaring mill wheels the waters whirled and snatched everything within their reach down to the bottom of the sea. Between these tumultuous whirlpools she had to thread her way to reach the witch's waters, and then for a long stretch the only trail lay through a hot, seething mire, which the witch called her peat marsh. Beyond it, her house lay in the middle of a weird forest, where all the trees and shrubs were polyps, half animal and half plant. They looked like 100-headed snakes growing out of the soil. All their branches were long, slimy arms, with fingers like wriggling worms. They squirmed, joint by joint, from their roots to their outermost tentacles, and whatever they could lay hold of they twined around and never let go. The little mermaid was terrified and stopped at the edge of the forest. Her heart thumped with fear, and she nearly turned back. But then she remembered the prince and the souls that men have, and she summoned her courage. She bound her long, flowing locks closely about her head, so that the polyps could not catch hold of them, folded her arms across her breast, and darted through the water like a fish, in among the slimy polyps that stretched out their writhing arms and fingers to seize her. She saw that every one of them held something that it had caught with its hundreds of little tentacles, and to which it clung, as with strong hoops of steel. The white bones of men who had perished at sea and sunk to these depths could be seen in the polyps' arms. Ships' rudders and seamen's chests and the skeletons of land animals had also fallen into their clutches, but the most ghastly sight of all was a little mermaid whom they had caught and strangled. She reached a large muddy clearing in the forest where big fat water snakes slithered about, showing their foul yellowish bellies. In the middle of this clearing was a house built of the bones of shipwrecked men, and there sat the sea witch, letting a toad eat out of her mouth just as we might feed sugar to a little canary bird. She called the ugly fat water snakes her little chickabiddies and let them crawl and sprawl about on her spongy bosom. "I know exactly what you want," said the sea witch. "It is very foolish of you, but just the same you shall have your way, for it will bring you to grief, my proud princess. You want to get rid of your fishtail and have 2 props instead, so that you can walk about like a human creature and have the young prince fall in love with you and win him and an immortal soul besides." At this, the witch gave such a loud, cackling laugh that the toad and the snakes were shaken to the ground, where they lay writhing. "You are just in time," said the witch. "After the sun comes up tomorrow, a whole year would have to go by before I could be of any help to you. Jay shall compound you a draught, and before sunrise you must swim to the shore with it, seat yourself on dry land and drink the draught down. Then your tail will divide and shrink until it becomes what the people on earth call a pair of shapely legs. But it will hurt. It will feel as if a sharp sword slashed through you. Everyone who sees you will say that you are the most graceful human being they have ever laid eyes on, for you will keep your gliding movement, and no dancer will be able to tread as lightly as you. But every step you take will feel as if you were treading upon knife blades so sharp that blood must flow. I am willing to help you, but are you willing to suffer all this?" "Yes," the little mermaid said in a trembling voice as she thought of the prince and of gaining a human soul. "Remember," said the witch, "once you have taken a human form, you can never be a mermaid again. You can never come back through the waters to your sisters or to your father's palace. And if you do not win the love of the prince so completely that for your sake he forgets his father and mother, cleaves to you with his every thought and his whole heart, and lets the priest join your hands in marriage, then you will win no immortal soul. If he marries someone else, your heart will break on the very next morning, and you will become foam of the sea." "I shall take that risk," said the little mermaid, but she turned as pale as death. "Also, you will have to pay me," said the witch, "and it is no trifling price that I'm asking. You have the sweetest voice of anyone down here at the bottom of the sea, and while I don't doubt that you would like to captivate the prince with it, you must give this voice to me. I will take the very best thing that you have in return for my sovereign draught. I must pour my own blood in it to make the drink as sharp as a two-edged sword." "But if you take my voice," said the little mermaid, "what will be left to me?" "Your lovely form," the witch told her, "your gliding movements and your eloquent eyes. With these you can easily enchant a human heart. Well, have you lost your courage? Stick out your little tongue and I shall cut it off. I'll have my price and you shall have the potent draught." "Go ahead," said the little mermaid. The witch hung her cauldron over the flames to brew the draught. "Cleanliness is a good thing," she said, as she tied her snakes in a knot and scoured out the pot with them. Then she pricked herself in the chest and let her black blood splash into the cauldron. Steam swirled up from it, in such ghastly shapes that anyone would have been terrified by them. The witch constantly threw new ingredients into the cauldron, and it started to boil with a sound like that of a crocodile shedding tears. When the draught was ready at last, it looked as clear as the purest water. "There's your draught," said the witch, and she cut off the tongue of the little mermaid, who now was dumb and could neither sing nor talk. "Now, if the polyps should pounce on you when you walk back through my wood," the witch said, "just spill a drop of this brew upon them, and their tentacles will break in 1,000 pieces." But there was no need of that, for the polyps curled up in terror as soon as they saw the bright draught. It glittered in the little mermaid's hand as if it were a shining star. So she soon traversed the forest, the marsh, and the place of raging whirlpools. She could see her father's palace. The lights had been snuffed out in the great ballroom, and doubtless everyone in the palace was asleep, but she dared not go near them, now that she was stricken dumb and was leaving her home forever. Her heart felt as if it would break with grief. She tiptoed into the garden, took one flower from each of her sister's little plots, blew 1,000 kisses toward the palace, and then mounted up through the dark blue sea. The sun had not yet risen when she saw the prince's palace. As she climbed his splendid marble staircase, the moon was shining clear. The little mermaid swallowed the bitter, fiery draught, and it was as if a two-edged sword struck through her frail body. She swooned away and lay there as if she were dead. When the sun rose over the sea, she awoke and felt a flash of pain, but directly in front of her stood the handsome young prince, gazing at her with his coal-black eyes. Lowering her gaze, she saw that her fishtail was gone, and that she had the loveliest pair of white legs any young maid could hope to have. But she was naked, so she clothed herself in her own long hair. The prince asked who she was and how she came to be there. Her deep blue eyes looked at him tenderly, but very sadly, for she could not speak. Then he took her hand and led her into his palace. Every footstep felt as if she were walking on the blades and points of sharp knives, just as the witch had foretold, but she gladly endured it. She moved as lightly as a bubble as she walked beside the prince. He and all who saw her marvelled at the grace of her gliding walk. Once clad in the rich silk and muslin garments that were provided for her, she was the loveliest person in all the palace, though she was dumb and could neither sing nor speak. Beautiful slaves, attired in silk and cloth of gold, came to sing before the prince and his royal parents. One of them sang more sweetly than all the others, and when the prince smiled at her and clapped his hands, the little mermaid felt very unhappy, for she knew that she herself used to sing much more sweetly. "Oh," she thought, "if he only knew that I parted with my voice forever so that I could be near him." Graceful slaves now began to dance to the most wonderful music. Then the little mermaid lifted her shapely white arms, rose up on the tips of her toes, and skimmed over the floor. No one had ever danced so well. Each movement set off her beauty to better and better advantage, and her eyes spoke more directly to the heart than any of the singing slaves could do. She charmed everyone, and especially the prince, who called her his dear little foundling. She danced time and again, though every time she touched the floor, she felt as if she were treading on sharp-edged steel. The prince said he would keep her with him always, and that she was to have a velvet pillow to sleep on outside his door. He had a page's suit made for her, so that she could go with him on horseback. They would ride through the sweet-scented woods, where the green boughs brushed her shoulders, and where the little birds sang among the fluttering leaves. She climbed up high mountains with the prince, and though her tender feet bled so that all could see it, she only laughed, and followed him on until they could see the clouds driving far below, like a flock of birds in flight to distant lands. At home in the prince's palace, while the others slept at night, she would go down the broad marble steps to cool her burning feet in the cold sea water, and then she would recall those who lived beneath the sea. One night her sisters came by, arm in arm, singing sadly as they breasted the waves. When she held out her hands toward them, they knew who she was, and told her how unhappy she had made them all. They came to see her every night after that, and once far, far out to sea, she saw her old grandmother, who had not been up to the surface this many a year. With her was the Sea King, with his crown upon his head. They stretched out their hands to her, but they did not venture so near the land as her sisters had. Day after day she became more dear to the prince, who loved her as one would love a good little child, but he never thought of making her his queen. Yet she had to be his wife, or she would never have an immortal soul, and on the morning after his wedding she would turn into foam on the waves. "Don't you love me best of all?" The little mermaid's eyes seemed to question him when he took her in his arms and kissed her lovely forehead. "Yes, you are most dear to me," said the prince, "for you have the kindest heart. You love me more than anyone else does, and you look so much like a young girl I once saw, but never shall find again. I was on a ship that was wrecked, and the waves cast me ashore near a holy temple, where many young girls performed the rituals. The youngest of them found me beside the sea and saved my life. Though I saw her no more than twice, she is the only person in all the world whom I could love. But you are so much like her that you almost replace the memory of her in my heart. She belongs to that holy temple, therefore it is my good fortune that I have you. We shall never part." Alas, he doesn't know it was I who saved his life, the little mermaid thought. I carried him over the sea to the garden where the temple stands. I hid behind the foam and watched to see if anyone would come. I saw the pretty maid he loves better than me. A sigh was the only sign of her deep distress, for a mermaid cannot cry. He says that the other maid belongs to the holy temple. She will never come out into the world, so they will never see each other again. It is I who will care for him, love him, and give all my life to him. Now rumours arose that the prince was to wed the beautiful daughter of a neighbouring king, and that it was for this reason he was having such a superb ship made ready to sail. The rumour ran that the prince's real interest in visiting the neighbouring kingdom was to see the king's daughter, and that he was to travel with a lordly retinue. The little mermaid shook her head and smiled, for she knew the prince's thoughts far better than anyone else did. "I am forced to make this journey," he told her. "I must visit the beautiful princess, for this is my parents' wish, but they would not have me bring her home as my bride against my own will, and I can never love her. She does not resemble the lovely maiden in the temple as you do, and if I were to choose a bride, I would sooner choose you, my dear mute foundling with those telling eyes of yours." And he kissed her on the mouth, fingered her long hair, and laid his head against her heart so that she came to dream of mortal happiness and an immortal soul. "I trust you aren't afraid of the sea, my silent child," he said, as they went on board the magnificent vessel that was to carry them to the land of the neighbouring king. And he told her stories of storms, of ships becalmed, of strange deep-sea fish, and of the wonders that divers have seen. She smiled at such stories, for no one knew about the bottom of the sea as well as she did. In the clear moonlight, when everyone except the man at the helm was asleep, she sat on the side of the ship, gazing down through the transparent water, and fancied she could catch glimpses of her father's palace. On the topmost tower stood her old grandmother, wearing her silver crown and looking up at the keel of the ship through the rushing waves. Then her sisters rose to the surface, looked at her sadly, and wrung their white hands. She smiled and waved, trying to let them know that all went well and that she was happy. But along came the cabin boy, and her sisters dived out of sight so quickly that the boy supposed the flash of white he had seen was merely foam on the sea. Next morning, the ship came into the harbour of the neighbouring king's glorious city. All the church bells chimed, and trumpets were sounded from all the high towers, while the soldiers lined up with flying banners and glittering bayonets. Every day had a new festivity, as one ball or levee followed another, but the princess was still to appear. They said she was being brought up in some faraway sacred temple where she was learning every royal virtue. But she came at last. The little mermaid was curious to see how beautiful this princess was, and she had to grant that a more exquisite figure she had never seen. The princess's skin was clear and fair, and behind the long dark lashes, her deep blue eyes were smiling and devoted. "It was you," the prince cried. "You are the one who saved me when I lay like a dead man beside the sea." He clasped the blushing bride of his choice in his arms. "Oh, I am happier than a man should be," he told his little mermaid. "My fondest dream, that which I never dared to hope, has come true. You will share in my great joy, for you love me more than anyone does." The little mermaid kissed his hand and felt that her heart was beginning to break. For the morning after his wedding day would see her dead and turned to watery foam. All the church bells rang out, and heralds rode through the streets to announce the wedding. Upon every altar, sweet-scented oils were burned in costly silver lamps. The priests swung their censers, the bride and the bridegroom joined their hands, and the bishop blessed their marriage. The little mermaid, clothed in silk and cloth of gold, held the bride's train. But she was deaf to the wedding march and blind to the holy ritual. Her thought turned on her last night upon earth and on all she had lost in this world. That same evening the bride and bridegroom went aboard the ship. Cannon thundered and banners waved. On the deck of the ship a royal pavilion of purple and gold was set up and furnished with luxurious cushions. Here the wedded couple were to sleep on that calm, clear night. The sails swelled in the breeze, and the ship glided so lightly that it scarcely seemed to move over the quiet sea. All nightfall brightly coloured lanterns were lighted, and the mariners merrily danced on the deck. The little mermaid could not forget that first time she rose from the depths of the sea and looked on at such pomp and happiness. Light as a swallow pursued by his enemies, she joined in the whirling dance. Everyone cheered her, for never had she danced so wonderfully. Her tender feet felt as if they were pierced by daggers, but she did not feel it. Her heart suffered far greater pain. She knew that this was the last evening that she ever would see him for whom she had forsaken her home and family, for whom she had sacrificed her lovely voice and suffered such constant torment, while he knew nothing of all these things. It was the last night that she would breathe the same air with him, or look upon deep waters, or the star fields of the blue sky. A never-ending night, without thought and without dreams, awaited her who had no soul, and could not get one. The merrymaking lasted long after midnight, yet she laughed and danced on despite the thought of death she carried in her heart. The prince kissed his beautiful bride, and she toyed with his coal-black hair. Hand in hand, they went to rest in the magnificent pavilion. A hush came over the ship. Only the helmsman remained on deck as the little mermaid leaned her white arms on the bulwarks and looked to the east to see the first red hint of daybreak, for she knew that the first flash of the sun would strike her dead. Then she saw her sisters rise up among the waves. They were as pale as she, and there was no sign of their lovely long hair that the breezes used to blow. It had all been cut off. "We have given our hair to the witch," they said, "so that she would send you help and save you from death tonight. She gave us a knife. Here it is. See the sharp blade. Before the sun rises, you must strike it into the prince's heart, and when his warm blood bathes your feet, they will grow together and become a fishtail. Then you will be a mermaid again, able to come back to us in the sea and live out your 300 years before you die and turn into dead salt sea foam. Make haste. He or you must die before sunrise. Our old grandmother is so grief-stricken that her white hair is falling fast, just as ours did under the witch's scissors. Kill the prince and come back to us. Hurry, hurry. See that red glow in the heavens. In a few minutes the sun will rise and you must die." So saying, they gave a strange deep sigh and sank beneath the waves. The little mermaid parted the purple curtains of the tent and saw the beautiful bride asleep with her head on the prince's breast. The mermaid bent down and kissed his shapely forehead. She looked at the sky, fast reddening for the break of day. She looked at the sharp knife and again turned her eyes toward the prince, who in his sleep murmured the name of his bride. His thoughts were all for her, and the knife blade trembled in the mermaid's hand. But then she flung it from her far out over the waves. Where it fell, the waves were red, as if bubbles of blood seethed in the water. With eyes already glazing, she looked once more at the prince, hurled herself over the bulwarks into the sea, and felt her body dissolve in foam. The sun rose up from the waters. Its beams fell warm and kindly upon the chill sea foam, and the little mermaid did not feel the hand of death. In the bright sunlight overhead, she saw hundreds of fair ethereal beings. They were so transparent that through them she could see the ship's white sails and the red clouds in the sky. Their voices were sheer music, but so spirit-like that no human ear could detect the sound, just as no eye on earth could see their forms. Without wings, they floated as light as the air itself. The little mermaid discovered that she was shaped like them, and that she was gradually rising up out of the foam. "Who are you toward whom I rise?" she asked, and her voice sounded like those above her, so spiritual that no music on earth could match it. "We are the daughters of the air," they answered. "A mermaid has no immortal soul, and can never get one unless she wins the love of a human being. Her eternal life must depend upon a power outside herself. The daughters of the air do not have an immortal soul either, but they can earn one by their good deeds. We fly to the south, where the hot, poisonous air kills human beings unless we bring cool breezes. We carry the scent of flowers through the air, bringing freshness and healing balm wherever we go. When for 300 years we have tried to do all the good that we can, we are given an immortal soul and a share in mankind's eternal bliss. You, poor little mermaid, have tried with your whole heart to do this too. Your suffering and your loyalty have raised you up into the realm of airy spirits. And now in the course of 300 years, you may earn by your good deeds a soul that will never die." The little mermaid lifted her clear, bright eyes toward God's sun, and for the first time her eyes were wet with tears. On board the ship all was astir and lively again. She saw the prince and his fair bride in search of her. Then they gazed sadly into the seething foam, as if they knew she had hurled herself into the waves. Unseen by them, she kissed the bride's forehead, smiled upon the prince, and rose up with the other daughters of the air to the rose-red clouds that sailed on high. "This is the way that we shall rise to the kingdom of God after 300 years have passed." "We may get there even sooner," one spirit whispered. "Unseen, we fly into the homes of men where there are children, and for every day on which we find a good child who pleases his parents and deserves their love, God shortens our days of trial. The child does not know when we float through his room, but when we smile at him in approval, 1 year is taken from our 300. But if we see a naughty, mischievous child, we must shed tears of sorrow, and each tear adds a day to the time of our trial." The Princess and the Pea by Hans Christian Andersen. There was once a prince who wished to marry a princess, but then she must be a real princess. He travelled all over the world in hopes of finding such a lady, but there was always something wrong. Princesses he found in plenty, but whether they were real princesses it was impossible for him to decide, for now one thing, now another, seemed to him not quite right about the ladies. At last he returned to his palace quite cast down, because he wished so much to have a real princess for his wife. One evening a fearful tempest arose, it thundered and lightened, and the rain poured down from the sky in torrents. Besides, it was as dark as pitch. All at once there was heard a violent knocking at the door, and the old king, the prince's father, went out himself to open it. It was a princess who was standing outside the door. What with the rain and the wind, she was in a sad condition. The water trickled down from her hair and her clothes clung to her body. She said she was a real princess. "Ah, we shall soon see that," thought the old Queen Mother. However, she said not a word of what she was going to do, but went quietly into the bedroom, took all the bedclothes off the bed, and put 3 little peas on the bedstead. She then laid 20 mattresses one upon another over the 3 peas, and put 20 feather beds over the mattresses. Upon this bed the princess was to pass the night. The next morning she was asked how she had slept. "Oh, very badly indeed," she replied. "I have scarcely closed my eyes the whole night through. I do not know what was in my bed, but I had something hard under me and am all over black and blue. It has hurt me so much." Now, It was plain that the lady must be a real princess, since she had been able to feel the 3 little peas through the 20 mattresses and 20 feather beds. None but a real princess could have had such a delicate sense of feeling. The prince accordingly made her his wife, being now convinced that he had found a real princess. The 3 peas were, however, put into the cabinet of curiosities, where they are still to be seen, provided they are not lost. Wasn't this a lady of real delicacy? Thumbelina by Hans Christian Andersen. There once was a woman who wanted so very much to have a tiny little child, but she did not know where to find one. So she went to an old witch and she said, "I have set my heart upon having a tiny little child. Please, could you tell me where I can find one?" "Why, that's easily done," said the witch. "Here's a grain of barley for you, but it isn't at all the sort of barley that farmers grow in their fields or that the chickens get to eat. Put it in a flower pot, and you'll see what you shall see." "Oh, thank you," the woman said. She gave the witch 12 pennies and planted the barley seed as soon as she got home. It quickly grew into a fine, large flower, which looked very much like a tulip. But the petals were folded tight, as though it was still a bud. "This is such a pretty flower," said the woman. She kissed its lovely red and yellow petals, and just as she kissed it, the flower gave a loud pop and flew open. It was a tulip right enough, but on the green cushion in the middle of it sat a tiny girl. She was dainty and fair to see, but she was no taller than your thumb, so she was called Thumbelina. A nicely polished walnut shell served as her cradle. Her mattress was made of the blue petals of violets, and a rose petal was pulled up to cover her. That was how she slept at night. In the daytime she played on a table where the woman put a plate surrounded with a wreath of flowers. Their stems lay in the water, on which there floated a large tulip petal. Thumbelina used the petal as a boat, and with a pair of white horsehairs for oars, she could row clear across the plate, a charming sight. She could sing, too. Her voice was the softest and sweetest that anyone ever has heard. One night, as she lay in her cradle, a horrible toad hopped in through the window. One of the panes was broken. This big, ugly, slimy toad jumped right down on the table, where Thumbelina was asleep under the red rose petal. "Here's a perfect wife for my son," the toad exclaimed. She seized upon the walnut shell in which Thumbelina lay asleep and hopped off with it, out the window and into the garden. A big, broad stream ran through it, with a muddy marsh along its banks, and here the toad lived with her son. Ugh, he was just like his mother, slimy and horrible. "Co-ax, brek ek eke kex," was all that he could say when he saw the graceful little girl in the walnut shell. "Don't speak so loud or you will wake her up," the old toad told him. "She might get away from us yet, for she is as light as a puff of swan's down. We must put her on one of the broad water lily leaves out in the stream. She is so small and light that it will be just like an island to her, and she can't run away from us while we are making our best room under the mud, ready for you two to live in." Many water lilies with broad green leaves grew in the stream, and it looked as if they were floating on the surface. The leaf which lay furthest from the bank was the largest of them all, and it was to this leaf that the old toad swam with the walnut shell which held Thumbelina. The poor little thing woke up early next morning, and when she saw where she was, she began to cry bitterly. There was water all around the big green leaf, and there was no way at all for her to reach the shore. The old toad sat in the mud, decorating a room with green rushes and yellow water lilies, to have it looking its best for her new daughter-in-law. Then she and her ugly son swam out to the leaf on which Thumbelina was standing. They came for her pretty little bed, which they wanted to carry to the bridal chamber before they took her there. The old toad curtsied deep in the water before her and said, "Meet my son, he is to be your husband, and you will share a delightful home in the mud." "Coax, brekkekekekex," was all that her son could say. Then they took the pretty little bed and swam away with it. Left all alone on the green leaf, Thumbelina sat down and cried. She did not want to live in the slimy toad's house, and she didn't want to have the toad's horrible son for her husband. The little fishes who swam in the water beneath her had seen the toad and heard what she had said, so up popped their heads to have a look at the little girl. No sooner had they seen her than they felt very sorry that anyone so pretty should have to go down to live with that hideous toad. No, that should never be. They gathered around the green stem which held the leaf where she was, and gnawed it in two with their teeth. Away went the leaf down the stream, and away went Thumbelina, far away where the toad could not catch her. Thumbelina sailed past many a place, and when the little birds in the bushes saw her, they sang, "What a darling little girl." The leaf drifted further and further away with her, and so it was that Thumbelina became a traveller. A lovely white butterfly kept fluttering around her, and at last alighted on the leaf because he admired Thumbelina. She was a happy little girl again, now that the toad could not catch her. It was all very lovely as she floated along, and where the sun struck the water it looked like shining gold. Thumbelina undid her sash, tied one end of it to the butterfly, and made the other end fast to the leaf. It went much faster now, and Thumbelina went much faster too, for of course she was standing on it. Just then a big Maybug flew by and caught sight of her. Immediately he fastened his claws around her slender waist and flew with her up into a tree. Away went the green leaf down the stream, and away went the butterfly with it, for he was tied to the leaf and could not get loose. My goodness, how frightened little Thumbelina was when the Maybug carried her up in the tree. But she was even more sorry for the nice white butterfly she had fastened to the leaf, because if he couldn't free himself he would have to starve to death. But the Maybug wasn't one to care about that. He sat her down on the largest green leaf of the tree, fed her honey from the flowers, and told her how pretty she was, considering that she didn't look the least like a Maybug. After a while all the other Maybugs who lived in the tree came to pay them a call. As they stared at Thumbelina, the lady Maybugs threw up their feelers and said, "Why, she has only 2 legs, what a miserable sight." "She hasn't any feelers," one cried. "She is pinched in at the waist, how shameful. She looks like a human being, how ugly she is," said all of the female Maybugs. Yet Thumbelina was as pretty as ever. Even the Maybug who had flown away with her knew that, but as every last one of them kept calling her ugly, he at length came to agree with them and would have nothing to do with her. She could go wherever she chose. They flew down out of the tree with her and left her on a daisy, where she sat and cried because she was so ugly that the Maybugs wouldn't have anything to do with her. Nevertheless, she was the loveliest little girl you can imagine, and as frail and fine as the petal of a rose. All summer long poor Thumbelina lived all alone in the woods. She wove herself a hammock of grass and hung it under a big burdock leaf to keep off the rain. She took honey from the flowers for food and drank the dew which she found on the leaves every morning. In this way the summer and fall went by. Then came the winter, the long cold winter. All the birds who had sung so sweetly for her flew away. The trees and the flowers withered. The big burdock leaf under which she had lived shriveled up until nothing was left of it but a dry yellow stalk. She was terribly cold, for her clothes had worn threadbare, and she herself was so slender and frail. Poor Thumbelina, she would freeze to death. Snow began to fall, and every time a snowflake struck her, it was as if she'd been hit by a whole shovelful, for we are quite tall, while she measured only an inch. She wrapped a withered leaf about her, but there was no warmth in it. She shivered with cold. Near the edge of the woods where she now had arrived was a large grain field, but the grain had been harvested long ago. Only the dry, bare stubble stuck out of the frozen ground. It was just as if she were lost in a vast forest, and oh, how she shivered with cold. Then she came to the door of a field mouse, who had a little hole amidst the stubble. There this mouse lived, warm and cosy, with a whole storeroom of grain, and a magnificent kitchen and pantry. Poor Thumbelina stood at the door just like a beggar child, and pled for a little bit of barley, because she hadn't had anything to eat for 2 days past. "Why, you poor little thing," said the field mouse, who turned out to be a kind-hearted old creature. "You must come into my warm room and share my dinner." She took such a fancy to Thumbelina that she said, "If you care to, you may stay with me all winter, but you must keep my room tidy and tell me stories, for I'm very fond of them." Thumbelina did as the kind old field mouse asked, and she had a very good time of it. "Soon we shall have a visitor," the field mouse said. "Once every week my neighbour comes to see me, and he is even better off than I am. His rooms are large, and he wears such a beautiful black velvet coat. If you could only get him for a husband, you would be well taken care of, but he can't see anything. You must tell him the very best stories you know." Thumbelina did not like this suggestion. She would not even consider the neighbour, because he was a mole. He paid them a visit in his black velvet coat. The field mouse talked about how wealthy and wise he was, and how his home was more than 20 times larger than hers. But for all of his knowledge, he cared nothing at all for the sun and the flowers. He had nothing good to say for them, and had never laid eyes on them. Thumbelina had to sing for him. She sang, "Maybug, Maybug, fly away home," and the monk goes afield. The mole fell in love with her sweet voice, but he didn't say anything about it yet, for he was a most discreet fellow. He had just dug a long tunnel through the ground from his house to theirs, and the field mouse and Thumbelina were invited to use it whenever they pleased, though he warned them not to be alarmed by the dead bird which lay in this passage. It was a complete bird with feather and beak. It must have died quite recently when winter set in, and it was buried right in the middle of the tunnel. The mole took in his mouth a torch of decayed wood. In the darkness, it glimmered like fire. He went ahead of them to light the way through the long, dark passage. When they came to where the dead bird lay, the mole put his broad nose to the ceiling and made a large hole through which daylight could fall. In the middle of the floor lay a dead swallow, with his lovely wings folded at his sides and his head tucked under his feathers. The poor bird must certainly have died of the cold. Thumbelina felt so sorry for him. She loved all the little birds who had sung and sweetly twittered to her all through the summer. But the mole gave the body a kick with his short stumps and said, "Now he won't be chirping any more. What a wretched thing it is to be born a little bird. Thank goodness none of my children can be a bird who has nothing but his chirp chirp and must starve to death when winter comes along." "Yes, you are so right, you sensible man," the field mouse agreed. "What good is all his chirp-chirping to a bird in the winter-time when he starves and freezes? But that's considered very grand, I imagine." Thumbelina kept silent, but when the others turned their back on the bird, she bent over, smoothed aside the feathers that hid the bird's head, and kissed his closed eyes. "Maybe it was he who sang so sweetly to me in the summer-time," she thought to herself. "What pleasure he gave me, the dear pretty bird." The mole closed up the hole that let in the daylight, and then he took the ladies home. That night, Thumbelina could not sleep a wink, so she got up and wove a fine large coverlet out of hay. She took it to the dead bird and spread it over him so that he would lie warm in the cold earth. She tucked him in with some soft thistledown that she had found in the field mouse's room. "Goodbye, you pretty little bird," she said. "Goodbye, and thank you for your sweet songs last summer, when the trees were all green and the sun shone so warmly upon us." She laid her head on his breast, and it startled her to feel a soft thump as if something were beating inside. This was the bird's heart. He was not dead, he was only numb with cold, and now that he had been warmed, he came to life again. In the fall, all swallows fly off to warm countries, but if one of them starts too late, he gets so cold that he drops down as if he were dead and lies where he fell. And then the cold snow covers him. Thumbelina was so frightened that she trembled, for the bird was so big, so enormous compared to her own inch of height. But she mustered her courage, tucked the cotton wool down closer around the poor bird, brought the mint leaf that covered her own bed, and spread it over the bird's head. The following night she tiptoed out to him again. He was alive now, but so weak that he could barely open his eyes for a moment to look at Thumbelina, who stood beside him, with the piece of touchwood that was her only lantern. "Thank you, pretty little child," the sick swallow said. "I have been wonderfully warmed. Soon I shall get strong once more and be able to fly again in the warm sunshine." "Oh," she said, "it's cold outside, it's snowing and freezing. You just stay in your warm bed and I'll nurse you." Then she brought him some water in the petal of a flower. The swallow drank and told her how he had hurt one of his wings in a thorn bush and for that reason couldn't fly as fast as the other swallows when they flew far, far away to the warm countries. Finally he had dropped to the ground. That was all he remembered, and he had no idea how he came to be where she found him. The swallow stayed there all through the winter, and Thumbelina was kind to him and tended him with loving care. She didn't say anything about this to the field mouse or to the mole, because they did not like the poor, unfortunate swallow. As soon as spring came and the sun warmed the earth, the swallow told Thumbelina it was time to say goodbye. She reopened the hole that the mole had made in the ceiling, and the sun shone in splendour upon them. The swallow asked Thumbelina to go with him. She could sit on his back as they flew away through the green woods. But Thumbelina knew that it would make the old field mouse feel badly if she left like that, so she said, "No, I cannot go. fare you well, my good and pretty girl," said the swallow as he flew into the sunshine. Tears came into Thumbelina's eyes as she watched him go, for she was so fond of the poor swallow. "Chirp, chirp," sang the bird as he flew into the green woods. Thumbelina felt very downcast. She was not permitted to go out in the warm sunshine. Moreover, the grain that was sown in the field above the field mouse's house grew so tall that to a poor little girl who was only an inch high, it was like a dense forest. "You must work on your trousseau this summer," the field mouse said, for their neighbour, that loathsome mole in his black velvet coat, had proposed to her. "You must have both woolens and linens, both bedding and wardrobe, when you become the mole's wife." Thumbelina had to turn the spindle, and the field mouse hired 4 spiders to spin and weave for her day and night. The mole came to call every evening, and his favourite remark was that the sun, which now baked the earth as hard as a rock, would not be nearly so hot when summer was over. Yes, as soon as summer was past, he would be marrying Thumbelina, but she was not at all happy about it, because she didn't like the tedious mole the least bit. Every morning at sunrise and every evening at sunset, she would steal out the door. When the breeze blew the ears of grain apart, she could catch glimpses of the blue sky. She could dream about how bright and fair it was out of doors, and how she wished she would see her dear swallow again, but he did not come back, for doubtless he was far away, flying about in the lovely green woods. When fall arrived, Thumbelina's whole trousseau was ready. "Your wedding day is 4 weeks off," the field mouse told her. But Thumbelina cried and declared that she would not have the tedious mole for a husband. "Fiddlesticks," said the field mouse, "don't you be obstinate or I'll bite you with my white teeth. Why, you're getting a superb husband. The Queen herself hasn't a black velvet coat as fine as his. Both his kitchen and his cellar are well supplied. You ought to thank goodness that you are getting him." Then came the wedding day. The mole had come to take Thumbelina home with him, where she would have to live deep underground and never go out in the warm sunshine again, because he disliked it so. The poor little girl felt very sad that she had to say goodbye to the glorious sun, which the field mouse had at least let her look out at through the doorway. "Farewell, bright sun," she said. With her arms stretched toward it, she walked a little way from the field mouse's home. The grain had been harvested, and only the dry stubble was left in the field. "Farewell, farewell," she cried again, and flung her little arms around a small red flower that was still in bloom. "If you see my dear swallow, please give him my love. Chirp, 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 chirp." She suddenly heard a twittering over her head. She looked up, and there was the swallow just passing by. He was so glad to see Thumbelina, although when she told him how she hated to marry the mole and live deep underground where the sun never shone, she could not hold back her tears. "Now that the cold winter is coming," the swallow told her, "I shall fly far, far away to the warm countries. Won't you come along with me? You can ride on my back. Just tie yourself on with your sash, and away we'll fly, far from the ugly mole and his dark hole far, far away, over the mountains to the warm countries where the sun shines so much fairer than here, to where it is always summer and there are always flowers. Please fly away with me, dear little Thumbelina, you who saved my life when I lay frozen in a dark hole in the earth." "Yes, I will go with you," said Thumbelina. She sat on his back, put her feet on his outstretched wings, and fastened her sash to one of his strongest feathers. Then the swallow soared into the air over forests and over lakes, high up over the great mountains that are always capped with snow. When Thumbelina felt cold in the chill air, she crept under the bird's warm feathers, with only her little head stuck out to watch all the wonderful sights below. At length they came to the warm countries. There the sun shone far more brightly than it ever does here, and the sky seemed twice as high. Along the ditches and hedgerows grew marvellous green and blue grapes. Lemons and oranges hung in the woods. The air smelled sweetly of myrtle and thyme. By the wayside the loveliest children ran hither and thither, playing with the brightly coloured butterflies. But the swallow flew on still farther, and it became more and more beautiful. Under magnificent green trees, on the shore of a blue lake, there stood an ancient palace of dazzling white marble. The lofty pillars were wreathed with veneers, and at the top of them many swallows had made their nests. One nest belonged to the swallow who carried Thumbelina. "This is my home," the swallow told her. "If you will choose one of those glorious flowers in bloom down below, I shall place you in it, and you will have all that your heart desires." "That will be lovely," she cried and clapped her tiny hands. A great white marble pillar had fallen to the ground where it lay in 3 broken pieces. Between these pieces grew the loveliest large white flowers. The swallow flew down with Thumbelina and put her on one of the large petals. How surprised she was to find in the centre of the flower a little man, as shining and transparent as if he had been made of glass. On his head was the daintiest of little gold crowns. On his shoulders were the brightest shining wings, and he was not a bit bigger than Thumbelina. He was the spirit of the flower. In every flower there lived a small man or woman just like him, but he was the king over all of them. "Oh, isn't he handsome?" Thumbelina said softly to the swallow. The king was somewhat afraid of the swallow, which seemed a very giant of a bird to anyone as small as he. But when he saw Thumbelina, he rejoiced, for she was the prettiest little girl he had ever laid eyes on. So he took off his golden crown and put it on her head. He asked if he might know her name, and he asked her to be his wife, which would make her queen over all the flowers. Here indeed was a different sort of husband from the toad's son and the mole with his black velvet coat. So she said yes to this charming king. From all the flowers trooped little ladies and gentlemen, delightful to behold. Every one of them brought Thumbelina a present, but the best gift of all was a pair of wings that had belonged to a large silver fly. When these were made fast to her back, she too could flit from flower to flower. Everyone rejoiced, as the swallow perched above them in his nest and sang his very best songs for them. He was sad, though, deep down in his heart, for he liked Thumbelina so much that he wanted never to part with her. "You shall no longer be called Thumbelina," the flower spirit told her. "That name is too ugly for anyone as pretty as you are. We shall call you Maya." "Goodbye, goodbye," said the swallow. He flew away again from the warm countries back to far-away Denmark, where he had a little nest over the window of the man who can tell you fairy tales. And to him the birds sang, telling him everything. And that's how we came to hear the whole story. Sleeping Beauty by Charles Perrault. In times past there lived a king and queen who said to each other every day of their lives, "Would that we had a child!" And yet they had none. But it happened once that when the queen was bathing, there came a frog out of the water, and he squatted on the ground and said to her, "Thy wish shall be fulfilled. Before a year has gone by, thou shalt bring a daughter into the world." And as the frog foretold, so it happened, and the queen bore a daughter so beautiful that the king could not contain himself for joy, and he ordained a great feast. Not only did he bid to it his relations, friends, and acquaintances, but also the wise women, that they might be kind and favourable to the child. There were 13 of them in his kingdom, but as he had only provided 12 golden plates for them to eat from, one of them had to be left out. However, the feast was celebrated with all splendour, and as it drew to an end, the wise women stood forward to present to the child their wonderful gifts. One bestowed virtue, one beauty, a third riches, and so on, whatever there is in the world to wish for. And when 11 of them had said their say, in came the uninvited 13th, burning to revenge herself, and without greeting or respect, she cried with a loud voice, "In the 15th year of her age, the princess shall prick herself with a spindle, and shall fall down dead." And without speaking one more word, she turned away and left the hall. Everyone was terrified at her saying when the 12th came forward, for she had not yet bestowed her gift. And though she could not do away with the evil prophecy, yet she could soften it, so she said, "The princess shall not die, but fall into a deep sleep for 100 years. Now the king, being desirous of saving his child even from this misfortune, gave commandment that all the spindles in his kingdom should be burnt up. The maiden grew up, adorned with all the gifts of the wise women, and she was so lovely, modest, sweet, and kind and clever, that no one who saw her could help loving her. It happened one day, she being already 15 years old, that the king and queen rode abroad, and the maiden was left behind alone in the castle. She wandered about into all the nooks and corners, and into all the chambers and parlours, as the fancy took her, till at last she came to an old tower. She climbed the narrow winding stair which led to a little door, with a rusty key sticking out of the lock. She turned the key, and the door opened, and there in the little room sat an old woman with a spindle, diligently spinning her flax. "Good day, mother," said the princess. "What are you doing?" "I am spinning," answered the old woman, nodding her head. "What thing is that twists round so briskly?" asked the maiden, and taking the spindle into her hand she began to spin, but no sooner had she touched it than the evil prophecy was fulfilled, and she pricked her finger with it. In that very moment she fell back upon the bed that stood there, and lay in a deep sleep. And this sleep fell upon the whole castle. The king and queen who had returned and were in the great hall fell fast asleep, and with them the whole court. The horses in their stalls, the dogs in the yard, the pigeons on the roof, the flies on the wall, the very fire that flickered on the hearth became still and slept like the rest, and the meat on the spit ceased roasting, and the cook, who was going to pull the scullion's hair for some mistake he had made, let him go and went to sleep, and the wind ceased, and not a leaf fell from the trees about the castle. Then round about that place there grew a hedge of thorns thicker every year, until at last the whole castle was hidden from view, and nothing of it could be seen but the vane on the roof. And a rumour went abroad in all that country of the beautiful sleeping Rosamond, for so was the princess called, and from time to time many kings' sons came and tried to force their way through the hedge, but it was impossible for them to do so, for the thorns held fast together like strong hands, and the young men were caught by them, and not being able to get free, there died a lamentable death. Many a long year afterwards there came a king's son into that country, and heard an old man tell how there should be a castle standing behind the hedge of thorns, and that there a beautiful enchanted princess named Rosamond had slept for 100 years, and with her the king and queen, and the whole court. The old man had been told by his grandfather that many kings' sons had sought to pass the thorn hedge, but had been caught and pierced by the thorns, and had died a miserable death. Then said the young man, "Nevertheless, I do not fear to try. I shall win through and see the lovely Rosamond." The good old man tried to dissuade him, but he would not listen to his words, for now the 100 years were at an end, and the day had come when Rosamond should be awakened. When the prince drew near the hedge of thorns, it was changed into a hedge of beautiful large flowers, which parted and bent aside to let him pass, and then closed behind him in a thick hedge. When he reached the castle yard, he saw the horses and brindled hunting dogs lying asleep, and on the roof the pigeons were sitting with their heads under their wings, and when he came indoors, the flies on the wall were asleep. The cook in the kitchen had his hand uplifted to strike the scullion, and the kitchen maid had the black fowl on her lap, ready to pluck. Then he mounted higher, and saw in the hall the whole court lying asleep, and above them on their thrones slept the king and the queen. And still he went farther, and all was so quiet that he could hear his own breathing, and at last he came to the tower, and went up the winding stair, and opened the door of the little room where Rosamond lay. And when he saw her looking so lovely in her sleep, he could not turn away his eyes. And presently he stooped and kissed her, and she awaked and opened her eyes, and looked very kindly on him. And she rose, and they went forth together, and the king and the queen and whole court waked up, and gazed on each other with great eyes of wonderment, and the horses in the yard got up and shook themselves, the hounds sprang up and wagged their tails, the pigeons on the roof drew their heads from under their wings, looked round, and flew into the field. The flies on the wall crept on a little farther, the kitchen fire leapt up and blazed and cooked the meat, the joint on the spit began to roast, the cook gave the scullion such a box on the ear that he roared out, and the maid went on plucking the fowl. Then the wedding of the prince and Rosamond was held with all splendour, and they lived very happily together until their lives' end. Snow White by the Brothers Grimm. It was the middle of winter, and the snowflakes were falling like feathers from the sky, and a queen sat at her window working, and her embroidery frame was of ebony. And as she worked, gazing at times out on the snow, she pricked her finger, and there fell from it 3 drops of blood on the snow. And when she saw how bright and red it looked, she said to herself, "Oh, that I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of the embroidery frame." Not very long after she had a daughter, with a skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony, and she was named Snow White. And when she was born, the queen died. After a year had gone by, the king took another wife, a beautiful woman, but proud and overbearing, and she could not bear to be surpassed in beauty by anyone. She had a magic looking-glass, and she used to stand before it and look in it and say, "Looking-glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the looking-glass would answer, "You are fairest of them all." And she was contented, for she knew that the looking-glass spoke the truth. Now Snow White was growing prettier and prettier, and when she was 7 years old she was as beautiful as day, far more so than the queen herself. So one day when the queen went to her mirror and said, "Looking-glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" it answered, "Queen, you are full fair, 'tis true, but Snow White fairer is than you." This gave the queen a great shock, and she became yellow and green with envy, and from that hour her heart turned against Snow White, and she hated her. And envy and pride, like ill weeds, grew in her heart higher every day, until she had no peace day or night. At last she sent for a huntsman and said, "Take the child out into the woods, so that I may set eyes on her no more. You must put her to death, and bring me her heart for a token." The huntsman consented and led her away, but when he drew his cutlass to pierce Snow White's innocent heart, she began to weep, and to say, "Oh, dear huntsman, do not take my life. I will go away into the wild wood and never come home again." And as she was so lovely, the huntsman had pity on her and said, "Away with you then, poor child." For he thought the wild animals would be sure to devour her, and it was as if a stone had been rolled away from his heart when he spared to put her to death. Just at that moment, a young wild boar came running by, so he caught and killed it, and taking out its heart, he brought it to the queen for a token. And it was salted and cooked, and the wicked woman ate it up, thinking that there was an end of Snow White. Now, when the poor child found herself quite alone in the wild woods, she felt full of terror, even of the very leaves on the trees, and she did not know what to do for fright. Then she began to run over the sharp stones and through the thorn bushes, and the wild beasts after her, but they did her no harm. She ran as long as her feet would carry her, and when the evening drew near she came to a little house, and she went inside to rest. Everything there was very small, but as pretty and clean as possible. There stood the little table ready laid, and covered with a white cloth, and 7 little plates, and 7 knives and forks and drinking cups. By the wall stood 7 little beds, side by side, covered with clean white quilts. Snow White, being very hungry and thirsty, ate from each plate a little porridge and bread, and drank out of each little cup a drop of wine, so as not to finish up one portion alone. After that she felt so tired that she lay down on one of the beds, but it did not seem to suit her. One was too long, another too short, but at last the 7th was quite right, and so she lay down upon it, committed herself to heaven, and fell asleep. When it was quite dark, the masters of the house came home. They were 7 dwarfs whose occupation was to dig underground among the mountains. When they had lighted their 7 candles, and it was quite light in the little house, they saw that someone must have been in, as everything was not in the same order in which they left it. The first said, "Who has been sitting in my little chair?" The second said, "Who has been eating from my little plate?" The third said, "Who has been taking my little loaf?" The fourth said, "Who has been tasting my porridge?" The fifth said, "Who has been using my little fork?" The sixth said, "Who has been cutting with my little knife?" The 7th said, "Who has been drinking from my little cup?" Then the first one, looking round, saw a hollow in his bed, and cried, "Who has been lying on my bed?" And the others came running, and cried, "Someone has been on our beds too." But when the 7th looked at his bed, he saw little Snow White lying there asleep. Then he told the others, who came running up, crying out in their astonishment, and holding up their 7 little candles to throw a light upon Snow White. "Oh goodness! Oh gracious!" cried they. "What beautiful child is this?" And were so full of joy to see her that they did not wake her, but let her sleep on. And the 7th dwarf slept with his comrades, an hour at a time with each, until the night had passed. When it was morning and Snow White awoke and saw the 7 dwarfs, she was very frightened, but they seemed quite friendly, and asked her what her name was, and she told them, and then they asked how she came to be in their house, and she related to them how her stepmother had wished her to be put to death, and how the huntsman had spared her life, and how she had run the whole day long, until at last she had found their little house. Then the dwarf said, If you will keep our house for us, and cook and wash and make the beds and sew and knit and keep everything tidy and clean, you may stay with us and you shall lack nothing." "With all my heart," said Snow White, and so she stayed and kept the house in good order. In the morning the dwarfs went to the mountain to dig for gold. In the evening they came home, and their supper had to be ready for them. All the day long the maiden was left alone, and the good little dwarfs warned her, saying, "Beware of your stepmother, she will soon know you are here. Let no one into the house." Now the queen, having eaten Snow White's heart, as she supposed, felt quite sure that now she was the first and fairest, and so she came to her mirror and said, "Looking glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the glass answered, "Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White living in the glen, with the 7 little men, is 1,000 times more fair." Then she was very angry, for the glass always spoke the truth, and she knew that the huntsman must have deceived her, and that Snow White must still be living. And she thought and thought how she could manage to make an end of her, for as long as she was not the fairest in the land, envy left her no rest. At last she thought of a plan. She painted her face and dressed herself like an old peddler woman, so that no one would have known her. In this disguise she went across the 7 mountains until she came to the house of the 7 little dwarfs, and she knocked at the door and cried, "Fine wares to sell, fine wares to sell." Snow White peeped out of the window and cried, "Good day, good woman, what have you to sell?" "Good wares, fine wares," answered she, "laces of all colours," and she held up a piece that was woven of variegated silk. "I need not be afraid of letting in this good woman," thought Snow White, and she unbarred the door and bought the pretty lace. "What a figure you are, child," said the old woman. "Come and let me lace you properly for once." Snow White, suspecting nothing, stood up before her and let her lace her with the new lace, but the old woman laced so quick and tight that it took Snow White's breath away, and she fell down as dead. "Now you have done with being the fairest," said the old woman as she hastened away. Not long after that, towards evening, the 7 dwarfs came home and were terrified to see their dear Snow White lying on the ground, without life or motion. They raised her up, and when they saw how tightly she was laced, they cut the lace in 2. Then she began to draw breath, and little by little she returned to life. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was no other than the wicked queen. You must beware of letting anyone in when we are not here." And when the wicked woman got home, she went to her glass and said, "Looking glass against the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And it answered as before, "Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White living in the glen, with the 7 little men, is 1,000 times more fair." When she heard that, she was so struck with surprise that all the blood left her heart, for she knew that Snow White must still be living. "But now," said she, "I will think of something that will be her ruin." And by witchcraft she made a poisoned comb. Then she dressed herself up to look like another different sort of old woman. So she went across the 7 mountains and came to the house of the 7 dwarfs and knocked at the door and cried, "Good wares to sell, good wares to sell." Snow White looked out and said, "Go away, I must not let anybody in." "But you are not forbidden to look," said the old woman, taking out the poisoned comb and holding it up. It pleased the poor child so much that she was tempted to open the door, and when the bargain was made, the old woman said, "Now for once your hair shall be properly combed." Poor Snow White, thinking no harm, let the old woman do as she would, but no sooner was the comb put in her hair than the poison began to work, and the poor girl fell down senseless. "Now, you paragon of beauty," said the wicked woman, "this is the end of you," and went off. By good luck it was now near evening, and the 7 little dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying on the ground as dead, they thought directly that it was the stepmother's doing, and looked about, found the poisoned comb, and no sooner had they drawn it out of her hair than Snow White came to herself, and related all that had passed. Then they warned her once more to be on her guard, and never again to let anyone in at the door. And the queen went home and stood before the looking-glass and said, "Looking glass against the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the looking-glass answered as before, "Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White living in the glen, with the 7 little men, is 1,000 times more fair." When she heard the looking-glass speak thus, she trembled and shook with anger. "Snow White shall die," cried she, though it should cost me my own life. And then she went to a secret lonely chamber, where no one was likely to come, and there she made a poisonous apple. It was beautiful to look upon, being white with red cheeks, so that anyone who should see it must long for it, but whoever ate even a little bit of it must die. When the apple was ready, she painted her face and clothed herself like a peasant woman, and went across the 7 mountains to where the 7 dwarfs lived. And when she knocked at the door, Snow White put her head out of the window and said, "I dare not let anybody in. The 7 dwarfs told me not." "All right," answered the woman. "I can easily get rid of my apples elsewhere. There, I will give you one." "No," answered Snow White, "I dare not take anything." "Are you afraid of poison?" said the woman. "Look here, I will cut the apple in 2 pieces. You shall have the red side, I will have the white one." For the apple was so cunningly made that all the poison was in the rosy half of it. Snow White longed for the beautiful apple, and as she saw the peasant woman eating a piece of it, she could no longer refrain, but stretched out her hand and took the poisoned half. But no sooner had she taken a morsel of it into her mouth than she fell to the earth as dead, and the queen, casting on her a terrible glance, laughed aloud and cried, "As white as snow, as red as blood, as black as ebony, this time the dwarfs will not be able to bring you to life again." And when she went home and asked the looking-glass, "Looking glass against the wall, who is fairest of us all?" At last it answered, "You are the fairest now of all." Then her envious heart had peace, as much as an envious heart can have. The dwarfs, when they came home in the evening, found Snow White lying on the ground, and there came no breath out of her mouth, and she was dead. They lifted her up, sought if anything poisonous was to be found, cut her laces, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine, but all was of no avail. The poor child was dead, and remained dead. Then they laid her on a bier, and sat all 7 of them round it, and wept and lamented 3 whole days. And then they would have buried her, but that she looked still as if she were living, with her beautiful blooming cheeks. So they said, "We cannot hide her away in the black ground." And they had made a coffin of clear glass, so as to be looked into from all sides, and they laid her in it, and wrote in golden letters upon it her name, and that she was a king's daughter. Then they set the coffin out upon the mountain, and one of them always remained by it to watch. And the birds came too, and mourned for Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, and lastly a dove. Now, for a long while, Snow White lay in the coffin and never changed, but looked as if she were asleep, for she was still as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. It happened, however, that one day a king's son rode through the wood and up to the dwarf's house, which was near it. He saw on the mountain the coffin, and beautiful Snow White within it, and he read what was written in golden letters upon it. Then he said to the dwarfs, "Let me have the coffin, and I will give you whatever you like to ask for it." But the dwarfs told him that they could not part with it for all the gold in the world. But he said, "I beseech you to give it me, for I cannot live without looking upon Snow White. If you consent, I will bring you to great honour, and care for you as if you were my brethren." When he so spoke, the good little dwarfs had pity upon him, and gave him the coffin, and the king's son called his servants, and bid them carry it away on their shoulders. Now it happened that as they were going along they stumbled over a bush, and with the shaking, the bit of poisoned apple flew out of her throat. It was not long before she opened her eyes, threw up the cover of the coffin, and sat up, alive and well. "Oh dear, where am I?" cried she. The king's son answered full of joy, "You are near me." And relating all that had happened, he said, "I would rather have you than anything in the world. Come with me to my father's castle, and you shall be my bride." And Snow White was kind, and went with him, and their wedding was held with pomp and great splendour. But Snow White's wicked stepmother was also bidden to the feast, and when she had dressed herself in beautiful clothes, she went to her looking-glass and said, "Looking-glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" The looking-glass answered, "O Queen, although you are of beauty rare, the young bride is 1,000 times more fair." Then she railed and cursed, and was beside herself with disappointment and anger. First, she thought she would not go to the wedding, but then she felt she should have no peace until she went and saw the bride. And when she saw her, she knew her for Snow White, and could not stir from the place for anger and terror. For they had ready red-hot iron shoes, in which she had to dance until she fell down dead. Beauty and the Beast by Gabrielle Suzanne Barbeau de Villeneuve. There was once a merchant who possessed great riches. He had 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls whom he liberally educated. The youngest girl was extremely pretty, insomuch that she obtained the name of Little Beauty, which created jealousy on the part of her less amiable sisters. The 2 eldest were extremely proud at being rich, and spoke to their inferiors with the greatest haughtiness. They gave themselves the most disdainful airs, and refused to visit other merchants' daughters, nor would they indeed be seen with any but persons of the highest quality. They went every day to balls, plays, and public walks, and constantly jeered their youngest sister for spending her time in reading or other useful and improving employments. In the course of time, by some unexpected event, their father lost his whole fortune, being bereft of everything but a small cottage and a few acres of land. "My children," said the tender father, "in consequence of my misfortunes, we must now work and labour." The elder daughters were very ill-disposed at this sudden change from opulence to comparative poverty, and obtained no pity from their neighbours because of their pride, but everyone sympathised with Little Beauty, whose engaging manners and affable disposition commanded respect. When they removed to their cottage, the merchant and his 3 sons employed themselves in tilling and sowing the fields and working in the garden that they might have corn and veg, tables for their support. Beauty rose by 4 o'clock, lighted the fire, cleaned the house, and got breakfast ready for the whole family. She at first found all this very fatiguing, but she soon grew quite accustomed to it. When she had done her work, she generally amused herself with reading or playing on her harpsichord. The 2 eldest sisters, on the contrary, were at a loss what to do to pass away the time. They breakfasted in bed and did not rise till 10, when they commonly walked out, and would frequently sit down under a shady tree to lament the loss of their carriage and fine clothes, when they would say to each other, "What a mean-spirited, poor, stupid creature is our youngest sister, to be so content with our miserable situation." But the father thought very differently. He admired the patience of this sweet young creature, for her sisters not only left the whole of the work of the house to her, but insulted her every moment. In this rural state, the merchant lived some time, when one day he was agreeably surprised by the news that one of his vessels, which he supposed was lost, had safely arrived. Elated with joy, the 2 elder daughters clung to their father when they learnt he was about to go and take possession of his property, and entreated him to bring them some trinkets and other useless baubles. Beauty felt an inward pleasure on her father's prospects of being reinstated in affluence, yet concealed her ecstasy. "You ask me not for anything, Beauty," said her father. "My child, what present shall I bring you?" She meekly replied, "I should like you, father, to bring me a rose, for we have none in our garden." The merchant then departed, but on arriving at the port, some dishonest persons went to law with him about the merchandise. So after a great deal of trouble, he was returning to his cottage as poor as he had left it. When he was within 30 miles of his house, thinking of the happiness he should enjoy in again embracing his children, he had the misfortune to lose himself in a thick forest through which his road lay. It rained and snowed terribly, and the wind was so high as twice to throw him off his horse. Night being come, he fully imagined he should die of cold or hunger, or be torn in pieces by the wolves which howled in every direction around him. The merchant, accidentally looking down a long avenue, discovered a glimmering light at a distance, to which he hastened. He soon arrived at the gates of a palace, which he opened, and was greatly surprised to find no one in any of the outer yards. The merchant then tied up his horse and walked towards the house, which he entered, and, to his great astonishment, saw not a living creature. He pursued his way to a large hall, in which was a good fire and a table plentifully supplied with food. As the snow and rain had wetted him to the skin, he approached the fire to dry himself. "I hope," said he, "the master of the house or his servants will excuse the liberty I take, for it surely will not be long before they make their appearance." He waited a considerable time, and still nobody came. At length the clock struck 11, and the merchant, overcome with hunger and thirst, helped himself to a chicken and then to a few glasses of wine, all the time trembling with fear. He sat till the clock struck 12, and not a creature had he seen. He now took courage and began to think of looking a little farther about him. Accordingly he opened an apartment magnificently furnished, which he found opened into another, in which there was an excellent bed, and being quite worn out with fatigue, he undressed himself and got into it. It was 10 o'clock the next morning before he thought of rising. When he was about to dress himself, he discovered a suit of new clothes in the room of those which had been drenched with the rain on the preceding evening. "No doubt," he exclaimed, "this palace is the residence of some good fairy, who perhaps commiserates with my situation." He then returned to the hall, where he found a sumptuous banquet, consisting of almost every delicacy. After partaking of a hearty repast, he repaired to the stable in which he had placed his horse. As he passed by one of the arbours, which was bedecked with roses, he gathered a bunch of them for his daughter, Beauty. At this instant he saw a hideous beast approach him, who, with a horrible grin, exclaimed, "Ungrateful man, I sheltered you and preserved your life from the pitiless storm, and in return you ungratefully steal my roses, more valuable to me than the whole of these possessions. For this nefarious deed you shall immediately die." The merchant fell on his knees to the beast, and clasping his hands said, "My lord, I humbly entreat your pardon. I did not think it could offend you to gather a rose for one of my daughters who desire to have one." "I am not a lord, but a beast," replied the monster. "I do not like compliments, but that people should say what they think, so do not imagine you can move me by your flattery. You say, however, that you have daughters. I will therefore pardon you on condition that one of them shall come hither and die in your stead. Do not attempt to argue with me, but go. And if your daughters should refuse, swear to me that you will return in 3 months." The merchant acceded. "But," added the beast, "it is my will that you go not empty or a. In the chamber where you slept, you will find an old empty chest. Fill it with whatever valuables you choose, and I will get it conveyed to your cottage." The beast retired and left the merchant to ruminate, "If I must die, I may as well leave my children some provision." Accordingly, he loaded the chest with gold. Mounting his horse, he left the palace of enchantment with no less grief than he entered it with joy. The horse of itself took a path across the forest, and in a few hours they reached the merchant's house. His children gathered round him as he dismounted from his horse, but the merchant, instead of embracing them with joy, could not, as he looked at them, refrain from weeping. He held in his hand the bunch of roses, which he gave to Beauty, saying, "Take these roses, Beauty, but little do you think how dear they have cost your unhappy father," and then gave an account of all that happened in the palace of the beast. "Well, father," said Beauty, "as the beast will accept either you or one of your daughters, I will give myself up to his fury, as it is on my account you have been involved in this trouble." The merchant in vain endeavoured to reason with Beauty, for she was determined to go. At which the elder sisters, who were jealous of her amiable qualities, secretly rejoiced. The affliction of the merchant was so great that he forgot the promised treasure, but on retiring to rest, discovered the chest of gold by his bedside. He, however, withheld the secret from his eldest daughters, imparting it only to Beauty. When the 3 months were expired, the merchant and Beauty set out for the palace of the beast, upon which occasion the 2 sisters rubbed their eyes with an onion, to appear as if they shed a great many tears, but both the merchant and his sons shed them in reality. They reached the palace in a few hours, and entering an apartment found a sumptuous feast prepared, of which they readily partook. Beauty was timorous, but a rectitude of conduct gave her courage. Just as they had finished supper, the beast entered. The monster asked if she came willingly. She tremblingly faltered out, "Yes." "You are a good girl," he replied, "and I think myself much obliged to you." He said to her father, "You may go from the palace tomorrow morning, and take care never to return to it again." He then withdrew. The father and daughter now wished each other a sorrowful good night, and went to bed, thinking it would be impossible for them to close their eyes. But no sooner had they lain down than they fell into a profound sleep, from which they did not awake till morning. Beauty dreamt that a lady approached her, who said, "I am much pleased, Beauty, with the generous affection you have shown, in being willing to give your life to save that of your father, and it shall not go unrewarded." Beauty, as soon as she awoke, related this dream to her father. But though it afforded him some comfort, he could not leave his darling child without shedding the bitterest tears. Beauty surveyed many parts of the palace and at length came to a door over which was written, Beauty's apartment, where there was an extensive library, furnished to illuminate the mind and cultivate the understanding, in addition to which were several exquisite pieces of music whose chords vibrated through the vaulted rooms with more than usual melody. This gave Beauty a favourable opinion of the beast, who she before conceived hostile. She then opened the library and perceived an elegantly bound book in which was written in letters of gold, Beauteous lady, dry your tears, here's no cause for sighs or fears, command as freely as you may, compliance still shall mark your way. Alas, said she, sighing, there is nothing I so much desire as to see my poor father, and to know what he is this moment doing, when casting her eyes on a looking-glass that stood near her, she saw her home and her father riding up to the cottage in the deepest affliction. Her sisters had come out to meet him, who, notwithstanding all their endeavours to look sorry, could not help betraying their joy. At noon, Beauty found every delicacy prepared for her, and at supper, when she was going to place herself at the table, she heard the beast advancing, who said, Will you allow me, Beauty, the pleasure of seeing you sup? That is as you please, she replied, somewhat intimidated. Beauty, in the course of conversation, overcame her fears, but when the beast asked her if she would be wedded to him, she paused for a few moments and then gave him an answer which implied non-consent. The beast, pitifully sighing, retired to give vent to tears. Beauty felt for him the greatest compassion and regretted his frightful appearance. One day she said to him, You exceedingly distress me, but though I cannot love you, yet you shall ever be entitled to my esteem, for the attention and kindness which I here witness. He then made her promise she would not totally quit him. In answer she said, I will not, but I am desirous of seeing my father, and if you refuse me this request, I fear I shall die of grief and despair. Promise me, said the beast, to return in a week, and tomorrow morning you shall find yourself with him. When you wish to return, you have only to put your ring on a table when you go to bed. This said, he bade her farewell. When she woke in the morning, she found herself with her father. A chest with a profusion of fine clothes, pearls and diamonds were also the gifts of the beast. Beauty awoke, put her ring on the table and soon fell into a slumber again. In the morning she found herself in the palace of the beast, and accordingly, as she dreamt, discovered him almost lifeless and extended on a grass plat. She recovered him with a little water. The beast soon opened his eyes and, faltering, said, Beauty, you forgot your promise. I had resolved to starve myself to death, but the sight of you reanimates me. Oh no, my beast, you shall not die. You shall live to become my husband. Scarce had she pronounced those words when the palace became suddenly illuminated. Music, fireworks, and all kinds of harmonic sounds announced the most splendid rejoicings. All this change of scene had no effect upon the lamenting Beauty, but judge of her astonishment when, turning aside, she beheld at her feet a handsome prince who thanked her for having broken his enchantment. Beauty inquired of this handsome prince what was become of the beast. You see him, Beauty, at your feet, said he. A wicked fairy had condemned me to wear the form of a beast, till a beautiful young lady should consent to marry me, and had forbidden me, on pain of death, to show that I had any understanding. You alone have had the generosity to judge of me, by the goodness of my heart. Beauty assisted the prince to rise, and they proceeded together to the palace. To her astonishment she found there her father and all the family, who had been conveyed thither by the beautiful lady she saw in her dream. Beauty, said the lady, for she was a great fairy, receive the reward of the virtuous choice you have made. You have preferred goodness of heart to sense and beauty. You therefore deserve to find these same qualities united in the same person. You are going to be made a queen. I hope a crown will not destroy your virtue. As for you, ladies, said the fairy to the elder sisters, I have long been a wit. Nest to the malice of your hearts and the injustice you have committed. You shall become two statues, yet under that form you shall preserve your present reason, and you shall be fixed at the gates of your sister's palace. You will never recover your natural forms till you are fully free of your faults. And to say the truth, I much fear you will ever remain statues." At the same instant, the fairy, with a stroke of her wand, transported all who were present to the young prince's dominions, where he was received with transports of joy by his subjects. He married Beauty, and passed with her a long and happy life because their actions were founded upon virtue. I hope you enjoyed this audiobook, and if you did, come back soon for some more terrific tales.